Welcome, everybody, to our 2020 Law Student Mental Health Day program called Exploring the Intersection of Racial Justice, Social Activism, and Mental Health. I am Janet Stearns. I'm the Dean of Students at the University of Miami School of Law, and I'm here today in my role as chair of the Law School Committee of the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs. The Commission works with a network of lawyer assistant programs, or LAPs, in each of our states and the District of Columbia. And the CoLAP, as a group, fights and has fought for many years to minimize stigma and bias that is associated with mental illness in the legal profession, mental health disorders and diseases that include addiction, depression, bipolar disorder, and other diseases. Our labs all include professionals who are here and prepared to support you and to support lawyers and judges in your community. And we are all here as partners with your law schools, deans of students like myself, and available to support you at any time. So call us if you need us. Each year, we partner with the ABA Law Student Division on the Law Student Mental Health Day initiative. And this is a time where we can raise awareness to the challenges that we all experience and the many resources that are available to help support each and every one of us. I would say that each year Law Student Mental Health Day is very, very important, but this year, 2020, it is clearly essential. All of us, your teachers, your administrators, the staff at your law schools, whether it is the AV staff, the cleaning staff, the secretaries, we are all experiencing huge disruptions from this pandemic in our lives, as well as we are very much confronted by the racial injustices in our country and this very heated national political debate. And so this is a time today and in this next hour where we can really reflect upon all of this and how we can work to restore ourselves and to create the space to take care of ourselves while fighting for change in our world. Our partnership with the Law Student today has been much enriched by the amazing chair, national chair of the ABA Law Student Division, Ayat Nizam, who is a student at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. She has given us radical insights and feedback on our plans for this week, and she really has used the power of her presidency to promote and diversify the law student leadership of the ABA. I am deeply impressed with her, and I am going to turn the program over to Ayat to introduce our featured speaker.
Thank you, Dean Stearns. I would like to first give a warm welcome to our guests and our attendees, as well as Dean Stearns and Professor Magee. The past summer, I've worked closely with Dean Stearns, and I can definitely say she's very passionate about mental health and wellness for law students and the legal profession as a whole. And I truly inspired to continue working with her in every aspect of my future legal career, because the work that we do is important in every stage, and I can see that first and foremost as a student. So thank you for all the work that you do. So now I'm going to introduce our great speaker. Rhonda Magee is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. She is a prolific author who draws on the law to write inspirational and thought-provoking pieces to better the world we live in. And last but not least, an internationally recognized leader dedicated to integrating mindfulness into higher education, law, and social change. Rhonda was born in North Carolina in 1967 and grew from the childhood trauma she had experienced. In order to not only persevere but prosper through life, she realized a life filled with care, self-development, and service with others was the only way to be. Since then, she has dedicated her life to growing, teaching, and ultimately healing herself as well as others. Rhonda went on to gaining her BA, her MA, and JD, all from the University of Virginia, before going on to the Oasis Institute at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center to train as a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. As a professor for almost 20 years, her areas of expertise include critical race theory, diversity and inclusion, immigration, mindfulness and social justice, interpersonal dynamics, race law, and there's way more. Rhonda's teachings and writings support a compassionate outlook on conflict engagement and management. In her book, The Inner Works of Racial Justice Healing, Rhonda explains the very core of social justice and how it may be approached and nurtured through mindfulness practice within a community. She truly believes in this day and age, where there is so much wrong within our society, healing is an ongoing process and inner work of oneself is essential. So before I pass it along, I just want to make a final note. This is meant to be an interactive and engaging conversation. So we have a Q&A function available for all the attendees. I would ask each and every one of you to submit your questions right when you have them. However, I won't call on the questions until after Professor Magee is done speaking. So she'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, and then we will go on to start answering your questions. So we don't want you guys forgetting your questions, so please feel free, as soon as you remember or have a question, just type it in and we can see it, and then we'll just answer it afterwards. So without further ado, I am honored to welcome and hand it over to Professor Rhonda Magee. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my dear Ayat. It's quite a pleasure to be with you and to be with all of you who've taken time out of your, what I know must be absolutely overwhelmingly busy schedules in the middle of the semester, to focus together in this community of practice and learning on the themes of really exploring the intersections of racial justice, social activism more broadly, and mental health. And so what I'd like to do is, let's see, I want to share a set of slides that I have here that'll just support us in this effort today. And as was mentioned, if questions come up, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and we will move through them. Later in the program, we'll move to them and answer as many of them as we can. But I really am a resource for you all. So if questions come up later, you can find me. I'm at the University of San Francisco, and you can easily find me online. So let's just kind of move into this topic, the intersections of racial justice, social activism, and mental health. I think that for all of us, we are, again, as was mentioned, are kind of in a moment where whether we thought this was a topic that, that we might turn toward, whether we feel really confident to be deeply turning toward these questions of racial justice and social activism, really exploring mental health as part of our work in legal education. We know that we can't avoid these issues anymore. Our current circumstances, literally almost picking up any day's newspaper, but without even having to do that, all of us are embedded in a world in which these issues of mental health are very, very real for all of us. Given the interlocking pandemics, the coronavirus just being one, the needs we've all had to adapt and in many ways try and maintain the best care we can of our physical health. But that's required, of course, moving in, sheltering, and physical distancing in ways that really have been challenging and difficult for most, if not all of us, in some way or another. And certainly if we've ever suffered with any problems around mental health, we may be finding ourselves feeling especially challenged. At the same time, racial justice and injustice are much more up and much more on the radar for most of us as well. We are much more aware these days of, let's say, many of us are more aware, some of us have always been aware of the ongoing racial injustice that is kind of deeply embedded as a set of legacies, the way in which our history is alive today. And not only is it about really the legacies of history, but again, the way in which ongoing, current, contemporary policies, practices, and programs, often unintentional, But we're now realizing it's not all only unintentional, unfortunately. We are being reminded that the long-standing policies and practices of the legacies of colonialism, white supremacy, and all other structures of racial hierarchy are, in a certain sense, again, a part of our lives today. The differential rates of coronavirus exposure and death. Just one example, the differential rates of access to education, adequate health care. We could turn to many different manifestations of these ongoing indications that we have a problem still around racial injustice and the legacies of white supremacy. And we could have said that even before the summer, when we had the horrific killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and a range of other individuals whose names now are, in a certain sense, not just reminders of the human lives that have been lost, the many, many, many different human lives that have been lost as a result of racism. But those names also now kind of symbolize a reawakening of awareness that we have work to do at the personal, interpersonal, and systemic levels to redress racism in our time. So doing that work is something that many of our law students are called to do right now in ways that are about pathways to career, but sometimes simply about ways of demonstrating a commitment to making the world a better place in their activism. And so looking at how that work really calls on us to attend to the mental distress that we may be feeling independent of those efforts, that may be being exacerbated by those efforts, is what we're drawn to do today. So really, in the next 20 minutes or so, I just want to unpack a little of some of the ways that in the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years or so, I have been exploring these intersections. And one of the modalities I've used is mindfulness and a contemplative approach to teaching and learning that I will talk a little bit more about as we go. But the basic thrust of my effort here is to simply create a space for us to inquire together about how it is that our work to redress racism, our efforts to respond to the many different intersections between racism and other forms of oppression in our time, and remake the world as best we can with sound public policy and community transformation efforts to transform our communities. How it is that doing that work is calls upon us really to attend to mental health inequities and to do what we can to really draw on skills and practices for grounding ourselves, centering ourselves, and being our own best mental health resource. That's been my work over the last 20 years or so, to explore these intersections. And so what I'd like us to do is to inquire together what we might know better about how to meet our students, meet our colleagues, meet those who we serve in the world at the intersection of these three tremendous points of experience. So I want to start by just sort of exploring a little bit about what I mean by racial justice. I use a definition that's a little different, perhaps, than folks, others who might be thinking about this. My definition that I've put here in this slide, love in action for the alleviation of racism. Again, the legacies of our history of white supremacy and that that hierarchy that had been deeply ingrained in our law and policy for so many generations. And by virtue of that, of course, it runs through so many of the systems that we're in, um, and that are in us, frankly. Looking at racism and seeing it as, and seeing racial justice as being about seeking to alleviate the harms that racism brought, like the harms that are manifest in all of us, in our lives in different ways. Some of us are more directly targeted, as we know, by racism and the sort of othering, the patterns of inclusion and exclusion, othering on the one hand, belonging on the other, the lines and walls, right, that we have inherited around differential notions of worth tied to this idea of race, which of course we've begun to understand is a social construct that was created to justify these systems of oppression. If race was created to justify the systems of oppression, and the systems of oppression around race that we call racism are still with us, thinking about how to alleviate or redress those systems has been, again, part of what drew me into law. As a law professor, I teach classes that look at the intersection of law and policy around race and racism in our culture. So looking at all of the different ways that, from the law of enslavement, the early law of immigration, and on up to the present day, the various ways that law for most of our history actually was arrayed in service of maintaining racial hierarchy and white supremacy. And it's only been really in the space of the lifetime of many of us on the call, including myself, that law has even possibly really been kind of forthrightly offered up, served up as a force for the alleviation of racism. I use love as part of my definition, partly because I'm, a student of Martin Luther King and others. Martin Luther King, of course, used love a lot in talking about his version, his view of justice. And in one of his writings in particular, he defines justice as power correcting that which stands against love. So I'll say that again, power correcting that which stands against love. And so if we are to enlist that power in standing against or correcting that which stands against the kind of love that we might extend to each other if we weren't so deeply trained in racism, right? If we're using power in some ways to correct that which stands against the sense of division and separation, the training in normalizing exploitation that is at the core, really, of systems of race-based hierarchy, then we've really got to, I think the idea of bringing love in as a corrective is not how we tend to think of what the courts do, but I do want to invite us to reflect on that as a possible way of thinking about this work. It's definitely what animates my work. I mean, you think about activists, for example, Colin Kaepernick recently said, we resist out of love. He resists out of love. So this kind of idea that what we are, those of us who are fighting for some new way and some way of manifesting not just racial justice, but social justice and the kind of intersectional movement for liberation, it's really inspired by love in an important kind of way. And so we can keep talking and looking at that, but just to say that this construct of race, a biological fiction, most scientists believe, and again, you can always find folks who disagree. We can get into some sort of debate, but the consensus, the majority consensus, is that it really is something that we've created, again, to maintain these systems of hierarchy. But that doesn't mean that the mere fact that it's a biological fiction doesn't mean that it isn't real in its consequences, right? Race is very real as a social reality, a social construct with impact on our lives. And racism itself, many have come to start to see, is a public health issue. It's an issue that we might bring science, art, all our best efforts to bear at eradicating, because of the ways in which it leads to shortened life expectancy, because of the ways in which racism negatively impacts quality of life, because of the ways that the social structures, policies, and practices that through which racism continues to be manifest really does physical damage to people every day. And so as we think about then mental health as a piece of the public health complex, if you will, that racism turns us toward, there are just so many different ways that we might, I think, better support the work of addressing racism. In the short time that I have here, I just want to say that I view mental health as foundational to what I call kind of personal justice. In other words, when I think about the work of trying to eradicate some of these legacies, trying to build, some of the aspirations of, let's say, abolitionist thought, right? The progenitors of the 13th Amendment, right? The progenitors of that post-Civil War Constitution that kind of gave new life to how we thought about this entire project of law in the United States. The progenitors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? All of these kind of beautiful efforts, multi-generational, international efforts to kind of reform the legal and policy complexes domestically and internationally that support liberation and thriving. These have all kind of gotten us, I think, to see that there are multiple dimensions of the work of doing justice. They include individual efforts to take better care of ourselves, I think. And that piece, I think, has become more of a 21st century way of thinking about justice, but it's one that I've lived in for a very long time. For me, I think of justice and the work to do justice in ecological terms. I think of there being multiple dimensions of work. So certainly there's those systems of justice like law that we often think about, and education, and all of the different ways that public policy and these institutions can enact justice are so important. But if we're not also looking at the interpersonal dynamics of justice and the personal commitments of justice, I think we're missing real important opportunities to actually begin to experience some of what the aspirational movements for justice were meant to deliver, right? So if we're trying to create a world of greater liberation and thriving, where we're not just surviving, but we're thriving, we can certainly be involved in these efforts to change law and systems. But at the same time, ideally, we would be figuring out ways to strengthen ourselves and take control of at least that part of the project of thriving that is within our purview. And so what I call personal justice, these efforts to really found our efforts to make change in the world in a commitment to doing what we can, right? To, just basic personal health and basic mental health practices, right? Getting access to the resources that we need for therapy, for counseling, but also for just recognizing the ways that our communities, all of our diverse communities, have in those communities deep and long-standing, differentiated sorts of resources for mental health. So I just wanted to name that I see mental health as really, really an important dimension of justice. as certainly an important dimension of public health, and in this sense, an important aspect of what we might be aiming toward in our efforts in law and social activism, in legal reform to address racism and other forms of oppression. We might include awareness of the work we might do and should do better to build into that work resources for mental health. So this conversation then is about deepening our awareness, and that's a little bit in the background of the slide, but raising awareness that there's a mental health dimension to the work of racial justice. And while we can work on doing the best we can for ourselves, we need support in our institutional spaces. We need support in our law schools. We need support in our communities for helping those who are on the front lines of this work to sustain in the work. And this is not something that law schools have traditionally provided for. We are in a place at a time where I think there's a movement for, and I happen to know there's a movement for having law schools provide classes and required, parts of curriculum that are devoted to law student mental health and wellness. I see that as very deeply allied with a movement for equity, a movement for anti-Black, racial justice, a movement for, third or fourth generation diversity work, if you will, and inclusion. Because of the ways that those of us who, whose bodies and genders and social identities have marked us as targets of race-based and other identity-based harm. Because those of us who are in these bodies in this time are often suffering the traumas, the long-standing effects of perceived or actual life threats and overwhelming experiences tied to our identity. Because a lot of us who are traditionally racial minorities, minoritized beings and bodies in these law school spaces, we're suffering. And so anything we do for overall student and staff and faculty mental health and well-being in law generally, it is going to have the benefit of supporting and helping sustain the work of engagement for justice. We're talking partly about building resilience, right? Building up the ability to sustain in the work. And that's true for those of us who are in various ways on the front line, including the targeted identities and minoritized and folks who are suffering in those ways directly, but also those who, by virtue of their ethical and other commitments, ally with targeted identity group members, and in solidarity with those communities, understand that we're all in this movement for justice together. Whether we're allies, whether we're on the front line, we're feeling ourselves targeted, we need more resilience. And these, there's so many different practices that can support us. For me, again, mindfulness is a practice I've offered to my students. Here's a picture of us at one of those long ago in-person retreats that I embedded into my curriculum at the University of San Francisco, where I offer a class on contemplative lawyering. I still offer that class now. We did our socially distanced retreat using Zoom this year. But at that retreat, I feature mindfulness, mindfulness-based stress reduction, a beautiful program, as was mentioned, founded at the University of Massachusetts, but one that I've adapted for purposes of our law students and for purposes of those engaged in really racial justice work as well. So I have two classes, in addition to my tort law class, where I embed practices for mindfulness-based support. And actually, this is one of my, I think, racial justice classes. But basically, I take both of them on a day-long retreat, or have done that, to create a deeper well of capacity building for sustainability in the work, for moving from fragility to stamina, to the degree that's a dynamic that people are working with, for working with our trauma and healing as we go. And so I guess I want to just say that I do see all of this as part of the ethical foundation that we're invited to drop ourselves into in law. And it's just, I think, an ethical imperative, actually, that we provide more mental health support for law students, staff, faculty, and lawyers in the world at every level, and all of those who support lawyering. It's just an ethical imperative that we provide mental health resources for the work generally, but also as we think about the imperatives of doing anti-racist, racial justice and social activist work and lawyering. So I just want to, the last slide I want to share in this regard is this one, which is embeds this idea that one of my teachers shares often. I'm tweaking it a little. He often says, as long as we're breathing, there's more right with us than wrong with us. And this is John Kabat-Zinn, founder of the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. As long as we're breathing, he often says, no matter how ill we may be, because he started the program actually to help people who were feeling physical pain and suffering in a hospital setting. And now it's been extended beyond that. As long as we're breathing, no matter how ill, there's more right than wrong with us. I'm going to say that a version of that applies to us as we do this work of living together in a multicultural world. As long as we're breathing, there's more right than wrong with being alive together in this world. But we need more support. And we definitely need more, I think, mental health and more robust support for wellness and well-being as we do this work sustainably together. So I want to stop there and see if we have questions. It seems like we probably do have some questions to bring us into an interactive conversation and inquiry about this.
Thank you, Rhonda. I think I can speak for all of us when I say that that was a great synopsis of your observations and the book. And I know there's so much more to talk, and I'm sure we can go on for hours and hours. But it is time for some questions, and we got some throughout your conversation. So the first one is from Michael Hernandez, and he is asking about the 2 minority lawyers that have been charged with throwing a firebomb into a police car in New York City while engaging in social activism against racial injustice in the days after the George Floyd murder. He's asking if this is a mental health issue.
Is it a mental health issue? Well, I mean, does it have mental health dimensions is how I would think of it. I mean, when you talk about minority or minoritized lawyers who were charged, and I'm not familiar with that particular case, I will say, who were charged with that kind of activism. Again, I don't know the facts and don't know if it will be proven or established this has happened, but just to hear that, stop and pause and see what's happening in your bodies right now. How many of you, just hearing that, you can just sense the distress that might be associated with taking those kinds of steps and feeling like, even as a lawyer, the traditional tools of advocacy might need to be, set aside for more confrontational activism. What kinds of experiences might be behind that decision? And just as we hear about it, if we're scrolling through, my students have given me this phrase, doom scrolling, right? We just like read one story and then all of a sudden you're like looking for more about that and looking for more. What's happening in the body when that's going on? Often we're being pain and suffering experiences, fears that we have are being triggered. So I just want to say that there are mental health implications for this, and we can look at them from the standpoint of folks receiving and witnessing this kind of engagement. But whether or not when someone chooses to, there are all kinds of different ways to think about what might be at stake around mental health and this kind of potential activism. And I will say that I think embedded in that question, at least for me, is an invitation for us to think about what do we mean by mental health, actually, and I'm here for that conversation too, because I think part of what activists are doing is sort of striking out against a system that purports to be well, that isn't, that purports to be sane, that isn't. And so, real questions emerge around, where the line of sanity and wellness on the one hand, insanity and unwellness on the other really lies, right? Because again, we know that systems of oppression have a way of training us and believing that collusion with the system is health, collusion with the system is wellness. And so this is a bigger question, I think, an inquiry than we can answer here. But I think it's the kind of deep inquiry that we should be supporting in ourselves and our communities amongst our students. And at the end of the day, when I hear that, I think of, for example, Angela Davis, with whom I've had a chance to connect, and who I've heard share about how she managed to survive during the period of her most intense trial, incarceration, etc. Right, where, for a period as a member of the radical anti-Black racism movement in America, she was part of an armed resistance struggle, okay? And she ended up in jail, and how did she survive? Through yoga, in part. This is her testimony. She still practices yoga. So again, to say that we need to look at the questions of mental health or not to, prefigure what kinds of responses we think are appropriate or germane. That's not my task. But what I do think is right and appropriate is for us to create space where we think about what does wellness mean individually, interpersonally, and collectively, and how can we move in the direction of greater wellness on all those levels. And if that means transforming the entire society, as it may, right, then how might we, through our various efforts, work together to make that a reality so that there is less suffering for us all.
Thank you. And I apologize if I'm going to say anyone's name off or incorrectly. Claire Grogan asks, you said pathways to careers that could improve upon racial injustice in mental health. Could you let us know how to get involved with careers, or which careers target these issues? If we do want to get involved in these types of careers, what steps would you suggest we take, especially as a 1L?
Well, I feel like I might have had one answer for that a year ago, and today, I think, with humility, I'm going to say, so much has changed, so much is changing, that the best advice for 1L who's interested in such careers is really to be very grounded and clear in your desire, aspiration, your values, the kind of work you want to be ready for when it presents itself. And then, take those steps presented and, do your best to explore opportunities that might provide a doorway into this. And I'm using this kind of conditional language because so much is changing. There are new careers being born this year, born of the events of this summer that literally were not available, certainly weren't available to the degree and extent that they are today a year ago, let's say, or maybe even 6 months ago. So your law degree is going to put you in good stead. I always feel that way. I've never once regretted going to law school, to be honest. Although, again, I don't presume to know what's best for every person. And I think we all have to, really discern these career questions for ourselves. But I do believe that with a law degree, and if you're also interested in mental health, there are ways that you can, for me, I studied mindfulness, as I've shared, and trauma-sensitive approaches to mindfulness. And there are many, many different trainings in those that you can intersect with law. And I can just tell you, there is a lot of work to be done. Corporations are far ahead of law and law schools in particular, I have to say on this. A lot of them are really, really trying to find ways to embed practices for equity, not just diversity, but equity and wellness in the workplace. And you know, having a law degree as well as some of these skills is not going to hurt you in competing for that world that's being created right now. And it'll be kind of in place, more ready for you in a few years than it might be right at the moment. But just know that the most important thing I think for law students to remember is, you know, there's so many pathways to the life that you want. And I found that to be true for me. When I was in law school, I didn't know that I would be here. I knew I probably would want to teach one day, which is important, because knowing that meant that at that moment when I was practicing law and kind of on a path to deciding if I want to commit to becoming a partner or going into teaching, and then a teaching opportunity or an invitation to compete for a job on faculty showed up, I knew my values, I knew what I wanted. I was clear enough that I was able to say yes to that opportunity to compete for that job and continue this journey to here. So I think it's just most important for you to be clear. The world is going to present all kinds of thoughts about what you should do with your life. You get to decide. But being clear about what your values are and what you want to do is the first step to then being able to pay attention, stay aware, and you will see a path to take at least a step in the direction. And then from there, awareness, discern, the next step will present itself as well. So, thank you for that.
Thank you. The next question is from Siobhan Demera, and she's asking, how can we incorporate community care and healing practices as practicing lawyers?
Well, it's a great question. And there are many, many ways. I mean, you know, we're coming to you, my dears, all of you who take the time to be with us, from like a moment where the world has already changed from what it was when I was in law school. I mean, we wouldn't have, well, we didn't have Zoom, but we wouldn't have had any kind of conversation about mindfulness and sustainability as we do anti-racist work. I mean, this kind of conversation wasn't available. But moreover, you know, there has been a generation of folks changing things, creating a culture of receptivity to wellness in law, so that major law firms and small law firms and everything in between, you will, my feeling is that if you go into a law firm and ask, is anybody interested in wellness, you will find at least one ally, one person, you know, one co-conspirator. And from there, work can be done. Work is being done. I've trained lawyers in prosecutors' offices, defense attorneys, so the prosecutors of a county in California and the public defenders in that same county work to train judges in that same county. And that's just one kind of county effort that we made in California. But there is an organization called the Mindfulness and Law Society. And mindfulness again, is just one modality. If you explore, you will find that there are many different ways that folks are innovating and coming up with new ways of bringing these wellness practices into law. And if it's something that you're interested in, you definitely, I mean, I always find that change doesn't happen by one person. It happens in collaboration and connection and community with others. So that question of like, who else here is interested is the key question, because then you're not all alone, right? Trying to change the systems where you are. And from there, you can network with others within and without, and, you know, just take that one step. It might just be bringing somebody in. It might be just holding a space for going together to a webinar and then talking about it later. In other words, you will definitely find ways. If this is something you're passionate about, you are entering the profession at a time where the world has made some pathways for you. You are not going to have to do all the heavy lifting. I mean, people know what mindfulness is today. When I started, people didn't know or would have laughed us out of our law firms. Now, major law firms are calling people like me in and presenting sessions. So it's a different world, and you should feel confident about asking for this when you go out into it.
Those are great points that you mentioned. So the next question is from, and once again, I apologize if I'm saying this incorrectly, Rainier Ramos, and they're asking, could you comment on the different issues that arise in getting more BIPOC folks into the legal community and into social activism in general? I personally feel that things such as imposter syndrome and an ingrained mindset of an inferiority to others has precluded people from even thinking about taking the chances toward taking the next step to step up for ourselves and for others.
So how to get more BIPOC, by which I think the question is referencing Black or Indigenous people of color into law, into social justice activism, how to do that. Wow, and then observing that, you know, sometimes the barriers come from within the community, these internalized sort of ceilings we place, or, you know, walls we place around what we can do and with whom. Yeah, I think this is a great, it's a great question. It's a very important question. And it's all the great and important questions are the kinds of questions that we can't answer here definitively, right? But we can maybe create a conversation and stay in it, right? Amplify this one as something we want to keep talking about together in our different places and spaces. And maybe live our way into, right, approximate answers that open up some possibilities. But, you know, I was on a call earlier where folks were talking about pipeline programs, right? So going into schools, going into high schools, going into undergraduate places and spaces, and just telling our stories and letting people know that we exist, you know, people of color in law, you know, innovating from within, and bringing this kind of wellness piece that recognizes that real, again, true justice is going to necessarily have to have a mental health component if it's true justice, right? We have to be able to, you know, heal our wounds and deal with the traumas that we are carrying that get passed on from generation to generation sometimes. So I think you know, even the healing professions, we need BIPOC folks in the healing professions. So whether it be law proper or healing, whether it of all sorts, we need more BIPOC folks who train in mindfulness, frankly. We definitely do. And there are, you know, new programs the programs for training are becoming more race sensitive and aware than they were when I came through. So the whole world is becoming more, I think, open to folks who would come in. But yeah, I think, you know, part of the work is helping people imagine a pathway forward and meeting folks where they are, helping them see that what we're talking about is something that folks in their communities may not have used this language for, but this is part of how we've survived in this culture through all this. There have always been people in our communities who knew something about sustainable practices. They wouldn't have called them mindfulness. Some of you know my story, know that one of my teachers was my grandmother. I consider my grandmother to have been my first kind of awareness or mindfulness teacher. She was not educated formally past elementary school because she grew up in the segregated South, born in 1906, when women who looked like me were not expected to do much other than pick tobacco and take care of other people's kids and houses. And so she did not have the opportunities that I did. But when I was a young girl, and my family was going through one of those traumas that was referenced, divorce and separation and domestic violence, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and would wake up early in the morning and see she would already be up, awake before dawn often, engaging in some centering practice. For her, it was prayer-based, but it was these were a set of practices that she leaned into to then be able to have a sense of her own value and worth, and then go out and do this unglamorous work of cleaning other people, you know, this one family's house who had her coming in every day, which if you have a house of your own, you really know, or anything of your own, you know, you don't actually need somebody to come in every day. It's a kind of again, replication of that history we're talking about. So I saw my grandmother find ways to center herself And I know that all of us, in whatever our communities, there are resources, there are modalities. And so helping people see the connection between things that have been working in their communities, trainings that folks can get, jobs and careers, and that, you know, we need everybody from all different backgrounds in this at this time, right? Because everybody's suffering. I think it's part of our work to sort of make it clear that there are pathways to, you know, life-sustaining employment, and a way of kind of doing this work. And we just got to kind of help people connect the dots. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. So the next question, I'm going to combine a couple because I think they kind of have the same overall themes. So Professor Tanya Washington's question asks that, well, she thanks you for your work and for highlighting the fact that self-care is revolutionary. And she asks, how do we as professors express healing in our teaching while traumatized by the realities we are all experiencing? And then I think in conjunction with that, Peter and Megan's questions also kind of attach, where Peter's asking if you could speak to practicing mindfulness and how it can change behavior, habits, and attitudes in minds and hearts. And Megan's is kind of also asking the same thing for students and professors and administrators and how they can be more heartful in the classrooms and campuses. Valuing emotion being a key component of mental health and racial justice, and just a broader sense of caring for ourselves and others. So from a professor's perspective as well as a student's perspective, and how we can practice mindfulness, I guess, to approach both of those mental health issues.
Yeah. Y'all are right here. You know, y'all are coming close to my heart now. Because, you know, I am right here with y'all. You know, I'm not coming in from on high, like, you know, I'm above all of this. No, I'm in it. You know, there's multiple interlocking pandemics that are landing here too. You know, there's, for me, horrifying rhetoric coming in over the transom, so to speak, and impacting me and my well-being too. And so this question of like how we as faculty on the one hand, but then also, you know, a faculty advisor to multiple different types of groups. My Black law students on the one hand, our disability rights and advocates and law students association, and you name it. And I am in a network of connection with other professors, especially faculty of color, Black female faculty. And we're all feeling everything that, you know, everybody's feeling. And we're the people who folks are calling on to create the spaces and hold the spaces and, you know, send them a message of we can do this. So I think we have to name that we need more support, first of all. And, you know, I do hope that more and more, as we say this and we kind of build allyship around it. So it's not just, you know, the faculty of color, if you will, who need this. It's not just the students of color who need this. We all need this, right? I don't love sometimes the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine for this, but in a way, right? It's like we all actually need this. And those of us who might raise our hands first and say, look, we faculty need more support. Of course, as always, it'll be a benefit to everybody. So, but, you know, failing like suddenly the institutions around us, like creating everything we need, you know, there are ways that folks are working together with some institutional support or without to build spaces of our own kinds of support. So find, you know, what has always helped me is to be in genuine, connected, what I sometimes call communities of practice. I think of this as a kind of episodic community of learning and practice where, you know, it'll only last for this webinar and we'll move on to our different, we won't ever come together like this. But we need these communities of practice. We need safer spaces, places where we can kind of let our hair down, so to speak, and feel it's okay to share lay down our burdens and share what we're going through. And we can ask for more support for that, even if it's just like time off of this committee or time, you know, in this meeting with this group of colleagues around the full campus or nationally, and have that count as something that we can put something else off our plate. And students too, you know, there are student groups, there are ways that you can ask too for more resources for this kind of thing, and you should. I mean, because again, just because we haven't been given these kinds of supports doesn't mean they shouldn't have been on a budget line item, a line item on a budget in the past. Doesn't mean they can't be in the future, even in a time of shrinking budgets. This is important. This is investing in the resources, students, faculty, staff, without whom the institution can't continue to thrive. So I just think that part of what we're doing is changing the culture so that, you know, the things that folks have just borne up on their own and figured out how to deal with on their own, we're now understanding that these were assets that were being given. These were resources that we were not being paid for, and that we are offering a service that is invaluable in these times, and it deserves to be compensated when it's offered, and it deserves to be supported when it's needed on the part of students with resources. So I do think we're having to change the culture, but it's not only here, you know, a big conversation around the country right now is how to shift resources to make real the promise of equity wherever it arises. So I am aware that we're coming toward the end, and we probably haven't answered all the questions. Can we perhaps, y'all have saved the questions and send them to me, and although I won't obviously be able to necessarily answer them right back here, is there, I don't know what we could do, but I hate when questions go unanswered.
Well, we are going to take you up on that, Professor Magee. First of all, I just, you know, I adore you, and I saw you in February, and I just wish I could give you a real hug right now, as I did then. But we are eternally grateful to you for your insights and your time. And as you said, I think we are creating a conversation that will continue. And we are hoping to continue this in many forms going forward. Ayat, thank you for doing such a fabulous, fabulous job with the questions. I am going to share here and remind you all that one way we can continue this conversation, if you can see my screen, is that we do have a workshop tomorrow that we are doing with the Law Student Division, and student leaders and all students are welcome to talk more specifically about how strategies to make real what Professor Magee is discussing right now at your schools. And so it's at 1 o'clock tomorrow. You can still sign up. We are going to have discussion tables, and we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we're going to really plan for the future in a radical way. So we're looking forward to that. And then Saturday is a day where we are truly going to invest in our personal well-being, whatever that looks like for you. Get outside, breathe the fresh air, do what you need to do to have a day of well-being. And please hashtag either Law Student Wellness and ABA Mental Health on social media so that we can connect virtually with the space that you all have. Again, we are very invested in continuing this conversation closely with all of our great work through the ABA and finding other ways to come together again. And let me just say in closing that each morning I wake up in gratitude, and I continue to believe there are so many hidden opportunities in this pandemic. Positive things are going to come from this moment. I want to remind everybody to take care of yourselves, to be well, to vote, and to continue to do everything that you can to really stay in touch with us so that this conversation can continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet. And I could do a pause together. Just one moment, a full deep breath in. A nice clean breath out. And thanks everybody for being here. And thank you, Janet and Ayat and Stephen behind the scenes. Everybody behind the scenes, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for attending. And we hopefully look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.